Kelly Beck. Thanks. I want to thank my colleagues Kelly Beck, Lauren Etchells, Priscilla Garcia, Alexandra Koch, and Luke Terra. We're going to be breaking up into 6 groups, so everybody on the call will be able to get to know one of these folks a little better. So as I mentioned, we're encouraging you to do a little bit of reflection. How do you define civic identity? That's in part what we're going to be talking about today. And then I am going to take a moment and set the stage a little bit for a conversation that we're hoping to have. So back in 2018, we started at the Haas Center throwing around a term, civic identity, but we really didn't define it. The concept of civic identity is perhaps intuitive, particularly for people who attend campus compact gatherings like this one, but it's not really well explored or understood. Colleges and universities are often places where students critically examine and develop greater understanding around a wide range of identities: race and ethnicity, gender, spiritual, political, nationality, and many others. We develop courses and programs and support networks that allow students to experiment, to explore, and deepen their understanding of how individual identities, how systems of oppression, how power and privilege afforded to certain identities impact our entire society. But we rarely take time to define and explore what we mean by civic identity, how it's formed, and how it intersects with our other identities. What we're really hoping for is to engage everybody here today in a conversation and that really kind of centers on questions like, does this concept resonate for you? What do we think might be missing? What pieces don't belong? What thoughts do you have about how your institution or how we as a collective might assess some of this work? So our purpose is really to present a model that really are just containers for things. Campuses will want to have the ability to structure the commitments and the building blocks that they choose at their own campuses, but a metastructure will allow us to talk about our work collectively. For example, when we say that one of the building blocks of a healthy civic identity is knowledge of a particular social change framework or a series of frameworks or strategies, we're not prescribing which one, but we have shared a few examples. Our hope is that the containers that we've provided will allow for a cross-campus conversation, possibly sharing better around best practices and the ways that our campuses, centers, and programs cultivate a healthy civic identity. So my experience at workshops and conferences is very often a lot of attention is paid to the means, the how, things like here's service learning courses, here's internships, this is what we do with community service opportunities. What we hope to talk about today are more the ends, what we collectively see as outcomes for students who engage in our programs, our classes, our cohorts, or initiatives that we organize and support. So in an effort to better understand these concepts and reconcile different opinions, we held at Stanford and at the Haas Center a series of campus-wide conversations with stakeholders at last summer and early in the fall. The paper that each of you received, and I hope that everybody had at least some time to skim, we'll assume or pretend that you have, that was the product of those conversations. We hope to go in a little bit of high-level concepts before we break up into small groups around each of the 3 areas. But first, I want to say, and I want to point out how the core commitments, how we view the core commitments and building blocks and the relationship between them. The core commitments are observable and they're not fixed. They're distinguished from building blocks insofar as that they're more intrinsic and they're expression of individual values. And therefore they're harder to objectively assess or target for improvement. The building blocks by comparison typically involve more specific skills or competencies, and the processes of acquiring those skills are more easily observable by external parties. The relationship between the core commitments and the building blocks is a symbiotic one and a reversible one. And what we mean by that is that a clear commitment to a particular social issue, for example, often motivates a person to develop deeper content knowledge in that issue, and the reverse is also possible. The second thing that we want to mention is that the issue around the development of a civic identity outside of a democracy. A core commitment to democratic values, and I want to make this really clear, it does not mean it's impossible to cultivate a healthy civic identity outside of a democracy, nor does it presuppose democracy as the best form of governance, although we suggest a healthy civic identity is clearly easier to cultivate when the people have the authority to deliberate and participate meaningfully in decision-making on public issues. So in a moment, we'll be splitting up into small groups, and we want to focus on one of three major sections: how a civic identity is defined, what are the core commitments, and then the third is the building blocks. And I'll say just a few things about identity, the civic identity definition conversation, and then I'm going to pass it to Alexandra and Lauren, who will briefly talk a little bit about the other two sections. So in terms of civic identity, one of the first things I want to say is there's surprisingly little that's written about how civic identity as a concept is defined or how it's formed. Lee Neffelkamp's definition, which I think is really elegant, is quote, how one situates oneself in community, and it's comprised of four characteristics. It's developed through engagement with others. It's distinct from, but deeply connected to complex intellectual and ethical development. The third thing is that it's a holistic practice that requires the integration of civic thinking, critical thinking, and capacity for empathy. And the last is that it's a deliberately chosen and repeatedly enacted aspect of the self. So in our small group conversation, I just want to point out that we will likely, if you go to the link, we'll likely be focused a lot on the bullet points on page 3 and 4. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Alexandra, I think you're next, right?
That's correct. Thanks so much, Tom. And thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Really excited to get into the breakout rooms and get into this discussion. Just really quickly, way of background, I'm going to briefly outline the three core commitments that we discuss underpinning a healthy civic identity. The first being a commitment to democratic values, practices, and institutions. These can include democratic values such as equality, fairness, individual autonomy, and non-discrimination. And practices of democracy can include those such as the ability to assemble, vote, and the non-discrimination, and the ability to kind of speak one's mind without fear of unwarranted government interference or retribution. And so I also want to identify that a commitment is a bit different from faith, as it requires us to kind of critically and continuously examine our practices and institutions and to pursue change when they fall short of our values. So we're engaging in kind of ongoing process of understanding one's culture, one's identity, one's biases, and one's positionality, and seeing that as really critical to engaging ethically and effectively within a community. The second is a focused commitment or commitments to a particular issue or issues. Having commitments without knowledge about an issue can be ineffective, and having the knowledge but without the commitment, I think, can prevent action from being taken. So making change, we think, requires us to fight for what we believe in. And the first step of that is kind of understanding what those beliefs are. And a healthy civic identity is manifesting kind of an ongoing exploration of what one will contribute to the common goal. As we bring it back to campuses, kind of our goal as educators should not be alignment necessarily with our own commitments, but actually an exposure to a broad array of public issues and frameworks to assist in analyzing potential solutions and encouraging students to do so as well. The third and final core commitment is integrity. These are deeply, deeply connected to the first two. We see integrity, and we outline this a bit more in our document, as an active practice, not a static virtue, and believe that involves honesty, respect, reliability, and very importantly, the ability to generate trust. So as part of our civic identity framework, the core commitment to integrity is manifested by a regular and rigorous personal assessment of how one's actions, speech, and thoughts align with one's commitment to social justice and the issues that are most meaningful to them. So in smaller groups, our hope is that we can hear from all of you on what you think of the general concept of core commitments, what you think of these core commitments in particular, what may be missing, and what may be the most effective way for educational institutions to support students in realizing or strengthening these core commitments. And with that, I will pass it over to Lauren to briefly outline the building blocks.
Thanks, Alexandra. So as Tom mentioned when describing this framework, the building blocks of civic identity are specific skills and competencies that as institutions we can hopefully observe and measure in our students. We have outlined 6 of these building blocks, which are first, a communitarian mindset, which is our relationship to the concept of community and defining our roles and responsibilities within the communities we belong to. Number 2 is a capacity to engage constructively across difference. This means moving away from an us versus them mindset in order to bridge political and social divides and engage in constructive conversation. Number 3 is democratic knowledge, habits, and skills. The specifics of which democratic knowledge, habits, and skills to emphasize are heavily debated. We've listed a few examples in the document, but would love to hear more about what skills you're targeting in your campus civic education efforts. Number 4 is knowledge of social change frameworks and tools. We've listed a few examples, again, of social change frameworks and tools in the document that we use in our work at the Haas Center, but as Tom mentioned, these are not meant to be prescriptive. Number 5 is deep content knowledge. This correlates with the core commitment to a specific issue or set of issues. So one should strive to develop deep content knowledge around the issue that one is committed to and the historical context surrounding that issue. And finally, number 6 is a resilient mind, body, and spirit. Some call this self-care, and we believe that you can't care for your community without caring for yourself, and that community care is also self-care. So if you end up in one of the small group conversations around the building blocks, these conversations will center around whether or not we feel any building blocks are missing from this list, as well as what challenges universities face in supporting the cultivation of the building blocks. Tom and Alexandra, did I miss anything? Anything else you'd like to add before we go to breakout rooms? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie to get us set up in our breakout rooms.
Yeah, so I am going to send you all into breakout rooms. They've been randomly assigned. If you end up in a breakout room that's talking about one of the 3 commitments that you didn't necessarily want to talk about, feel free to come back to the main room and I can put you in a different room. But please do that early on in the conversation because we want to make sure that you're able to engage as well as possible. You're going to be using Jamboards in these. And so I'm just going to share my screen for a quick second so that I can show you just a little bit about what that means. So Jamboards are pretty easy to use. What you're going to do when you get in here is there's questions already populated and there's going to be leaders in each room. They're going to tell you when to answer these questions. And then right here on the left side, there's a thing that says sticky note. You press the sticky note and it pops up. You can choose your color and you just type in your thoughts about that. And then you press save and it shows up on the board. So you can move them around. You can group them together. The nice thing is that this is just like using a whiteboard. So again, the host in your room will help you identify these. So I'm going to open up these rooms right now. And again, if you have any issues, just feel free to come back into the main room and I will put you in a new room.
Good. Sorry, group. I should have managed your time differently, maybe.
Welcome back, folks. I think, are we all back, Natalie? It looks like folks are back, right? Yeah. I hope you had some good, rich conversations in the small groups, digging a little deeper into some of these ideas. And what wanted to focus on now is just a few minutes for some debrief, at least. So I don't know if the slide is up. Do we have the slide? I'm happy to go through what some of the things I would love to hear back from some of the groups about. What are some of the, the tensions that arose from this conversation? Are there things that you talked about within those small groups, that either articulated with sort of what's going on in your campuses, or some things that, you were kind of struggling with? So maybe we'll start with that first question around tensions, and feel free to either share it in the chat or please feel free to speak up as well and just unmute your microphone and speak to the group.
Hi, Darby from Bates College up in Maine here. We talked a little bit about the tension between the language of democratic values and the language of social justice, and recognizing, that in polarized times, perhaps the top priority should be getting people to talk to each other. But another priority might be trying to break through the sort of dominance of, oh, well, never mind. I don't want to go into it. Anyway, social justice, it seemed to be missing. It doesn't seem like democratic values is necessarily a great proxy for that. So it's missing, and that would be sorely felt for many of us, or many of our students anyway.
Others who could share.
Hey, Clayton.
Dan, yes, I was just going to mention Dan's comment, and I'm coming right to you, Brian, about some of the tensions between civic identity and values and civic action. So that's great. Go ahead, Brian.
So one of the things I brought up was the fact that, I'm a privately funded center. So I've got donor and small institutions, so don't get any funds from the university. And so, we got the core, like as I described, we have the core of the students, but more and more, we've got this pressure from outside regarding donors and data for donors. And I have to be careful what the language I use with my donor. I live in Virginia Beach. My school's in Virginia Beach, which is arch conservative Pat Robertson area. So I have to be very careful, even though we are a very liberal university. I have to be careful of my language. And I also have to be very careful in everything I do, because I can't offend donors. And it gets tiring when I'm sitting there trying to explain stuff to donors, and immediately they get I say attitude, but they go down these other paths and they buy into stuff that's out there in certain select media. So I have to walk that. It's a very tight balance of what I do, and encouraging individuals to do, to create this active, complete civic identity, but it might go against what some of my donors and some of the board might think.
Appreciate that, Brian. Yeah. I also like folks to think about that second sort of set of questions there about, as you read this if you read through the document, discuss the framework a bit. Does this, how does this apply to your current campus? And Brian gave one example of how some of the tensions there around dealing with donors. It may look different at different campuses, but I won't speak for the Haas group here, but I think one interest is how can this document really speak to some of the different situations that are out there. So just wondering how people, as they read through the document, had these conversations, what they saw as things that really sort of applied to their work, or things that, how this might be altered to include some other kinds of aspects or some other kinds of areas to make it more useful and make it a more strengthened framework.
I will say from the group that I had the pleasure of chatting with, the question came up, props out to Ian. The question came up that is similar to this, I think, is this document intended to be focused at community centers and the work that we all do? Or is it really at the university as a whole, in shifting the culture of universities as a whole and the boundaries of our roles? So the example was, under the building blocks, there's a discussion of resilience of mind, body, and spirit, while we all said, wow, yeah, we agree with that, but is it our role at the community centers to worry about that and to engage in that, or is that a broader university? So there was question about this document. What's the goal? What's the reach? And if I didn't catch that correctly, Ian, please pipe in and correct my telephone game.
And Laura, I saw your comment on there. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that difference between sort of the little d democratic methods and the big D results.
Yeah, I was just reflecting back, hearing what Brian was saying about being stuck between kind of the donors and their desires and the work that we're doing and the things where students are, and how frequently our work, which I think is explicitly political, but it doesn't need to be partisan, but how frequently our work is interpreted, perhaps by people who don't fully understand it, as having these, liberal or progressive goals or aims, or that we're trying to indoctrinate people when that isn't really the goal. And I do think that, speaking for myself, I don't always do the best job of reaching out to people across the ideological spectrum. I think that's somewhere where we can grow as a field.
Any last thoughts folks want to share from the small groups, or any of the tensions or ideas or thoughts that came up? Carolyn, please go ahead.
Hi, so just jumping on that a little, we focus mainly on the definition itself, or the framework itself of civic identity, but sort of tagging off this idea of like balancing things and pleasing. It's political, but not necessarily partisan. I think one point that stuck out to us was this real importance of the relational aspect of civic engagement or civic identity, and like the relationships with others, because when you peel back all those layers, right, anything that's controversial, when you use words that sound controversial, like even if the word democracy now sounds controversial, it's when you forget the fact that you're with other people, like that's the foundational part of all this, is the relational aspect of it. I think we talked about that a lot. And, also, I think just for my own part, I found it really meaningful that it's not a written story, it's not done, it's evolving, and it requires education and knowledge, because I think the parts that people jump on and want to attack are the things they don't understand. When you really peel it back and say, we want to find a way to live with other people in a way where we all succeed, where we're all happy, where we all have rights and freedom and the ability to prosper. I mean, that I don't feel is something anyone can argue with. So, I mean, at its core, I think it's not controversial. What the problem is, we have to get to like the center of the onion, sort of.
Thanks, Carolyn. That's really well said. I want to respect time. I know we're at the very end. I want to send it back to Tom, who's just got I think 1 minute. He wants to talk to you a little bit about this upcoming journal. But last thing I want to say is just a thank you to Natalie Fertlat, who's our Director of Partnerships and Member Engagement, for facilitating this whole thing. Don't want her effort to go unrecognized here. So Tom, back to you.
Thanks, Clayton. Yeah, I'm going to be respectful of people's time, but I also want to say that I'm happy to stick around, and I think we can, if there are folks that have additional comments or questions, we're happy to, at least I'm happy to stick around and chat a little bit more. I wanted to make people, first of all, thank you. That was really great. I really enjoyed the small group conversation, and I just want to say it's fun because the large group conversation, boy, you just went right at some of the nodes of like the conversations we had here at Stanford, that tension between the social justice piece and democratic values. It's like, what you don't know is that part actually flipped in its orientation, and then it flipped back again, because we were like, oh, how does that actually, like, is it the means? Is it the ends? Is it like, how does that work? So that's a really, that's a juicy one. I want to actually just let folks know that we've been working with the Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning with our colleagues at the Ginsberg Center at University of Michigan. And we're going to have a special edited volume of the journal that'll come out in the summer of 2023. It's going to be around exploring the development of civic identities in college and university students. Luke, who's on the call today, I think I saw Christy here too. And Sandra Bass, our colleague at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the few times that Stanford and Berkeley actually work together. We're all going to be co-editors of this volume. Look for an RFP that'll be out sometime in March, sometime next month. The full proposals will be due in August of this year, and then hopefully full manuscripts would be finished and submitted by December 1st. So the idea would be that you might pick a particular part, a building block or a core commitment, and share some of your research or your thinking on those things. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And again, just say thank you to everybody. Thank you to Campus Compact for hosting this. It's great to see colleagues thinking deeply and really kind of grappling with some of the tensions that are in this field and in our work. So, like I said, I'm willing to hang out if anybody needs to or wants to sort of stick around. Also, just for the sake of this video, I want to say that if you're watching this video after the fact, we would be happy for you to ask for a copy of wherever this document has gone, because I can guarantee we're going to change it based on the conversations that we've just had. And just contact me, Tom Schnabelt, at the Haas Center for Public Service if you're interested in getting a copy of the most recent version of this document.
All right, thank you all for being here and joining us. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.